In yesterday's press conference, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah explained and reflected on his draft failures, particularly the 2022 NFL season, and he was actually very honest about it. The Minnesota Vikings organization is very careful on what they give the media. They're very careful on what they say about players and what they say about draft picks, but reflecting on the draft 2 years ago, Kwesi was honest, open, reflective, and gave the media a real answer. So let's dive into it. So Kwesi was asked about the 2022 draft failures, and he talked about like this 33-point comeback. He said, and I'll share the screen with you, why don't I, so you can read along with me. Here we go. I've thought a lot about those days and trying to compete on multiple timelines and different things like that, he said. I had a conversation with Kevin O'Connell. This is probably a year ago or something around then. I asked him one time, what was it like when we were down 33-0 against the Colts in 2022? You know, when you feel like you're down? When I entered the building trying to compete, aging roster, salary cap stuff, I think there were times when I felt down 33-0. As we all know, that game, it starts with one play, one drive, and you build. I think at times I might have been guilty of trying to maybe have a 33-point play all at once, which is a shot at the previous regime, Rick Spielman, Mike Zimmer, and those people. I think once I identified that, I kind of really I think if you've seen since then, it's been really foundationally just taking good steps, building to a certain critical point where I think we compete over the long term. And then it says, what does he mean by trying to have a 33-point play all at once? He said, I would just say a lot of times I think you can be creative enough to think of your issues, but that can be a bad thing, right? Sometimes it might just be, hey, let's just put one foot in front of the other and just make one decision after the other. What you don't want to do is try to solve all the issues at once, right? I think you still want to have long-term and short-term horizons when you make decisions, but you just don't want to be in a rush to get to that end goal. You want to be deliberate in your process, and we've done a really good job doing that since then. You know, it's tough when you interview for the Minnesota Vikings general manager and head coaching position. What you don't want to do going into the interview room and say, you know what, Mark, Ziggy, here's my plan. It's going to be slow. It's going to be deliberate. We're going to take our time. We're going to think about it. We're going to build a foundation. That's not sexy. That's not going to get you the job. So even though he's reflective and he's, thinking about his mistakes in the 2022 NFL draft, those mistakes ended up giving him the job in the first place because that's what he laid out to get the job. He said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to swap the aging salary. We're going to swap our linebackers. We're going to get young blood in the building. And we're going to be a fast, twitchy, exciting defensive team with Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson. And we're going to turn this damn thing around. That's what gets you the job. That's what excites owners, laying out that plan. And that's what he tried to execute. And looking at the Minnesota Vikings roster in 2021, the roster that he stepped into, let's take a look at it. It makes sense why he did what he did. You look at it. You got Everson Griffin, 34 years old. You got Anthony Barr, 29. Eric Kendricks, 29. And those guys have been in the league for a long time. They've already been in the league for 7 years, 6 years. Everson Griffin, 11 years. Patrick Peterson, 31 years old, 10 years. Harrison Smith, 32 years old, 9 years. It's like the guys that he stepped into were older and they were aging like he talked about. And what the problem was in this situation is, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but Rick Spielman pushed all the money towards the future. Kind of like what Tim Connolly did for the Minnesota Timberwolves. He gave up a 2031 first-round pick to get Rob Dillingham to trade up into the top 10 to get that guy. And it's like, he doesn't have to sit around and, be worried about that 2031 draft pick, because he's not going to be here in 2031. Whether he has a great seasons or not, he's going to be somewhere else. He'll be retired or he'll be on a different team. He's not going to be in the Minnesota Timberwolves at that point. Who cares about that pick? Kind of like Rick Spielman did. It's like, I'm not going to be around in 3 years to have to deal with these contracts that I push towards the future with all this dead cap money bull crap and whatever. So I'm going to spend right now and push these contracts towards the future and punish the future general manager. So that's what Kwesi Adofo-Mensah was trying to replicate. And you look at the players that were on the roster, and you look at the players that he tried to swap out in the 2022 NFL draft. Well, he got safety to try to replace eventually an aging Harrison Smith. You got a cornerback to replace Patrick Peterson. You got an offensive line. Who was the offensive line back in the day? You got an offensive line to replace Oli Udoh, who wasn't a very good player, mostly a career backup guy. Then you got a linebacker here to replace Anthony Barr or Eric Kendricks, another cornerback for depth to replace Patrick Peterson and get another cornerback in there. So defensive tackle to replace Dalvin Tomlinson, who's getting paid a pretty good chunk. A running back to eventually help Dalvin Cook out a little bit. He's still on the roster, so that was good. And, you think about receiver, O-line. It's like the Minnesota Vikings drafted 10 players in the 2022 NFL draft. And to defend Kwesi a little bit here, nobody knows who they're drafting. Okay. It's not just Kwesi that had a bust. It's not like, he knew that these guys would stink. The NFL draft is a crapshoot every single year. It's all bull crap. It's all a guess. Nobody knows who's going to pan out or who's going to work or who's going to bust. So he looked at the Minnesota Vikings aging roster and it's like, you know what? These guys are getting old and we need to mix it up. We need to get new, fresh blood in the building. And you know what I'm going to do, owners? I'm going to get rid of these guys, bring in these rookie contracts so we can afford them, and replace them with young players that have lots of talent in college. Like Lewis Cine, starting safety for the University of Georgia, who was a national champion. That makes sense. Andrew Booth Jr., a cornerback, Clemson or Tennessee. Very good player, had some injury issues, but super talented if he can just stay healthy. Makes sense. All of Kwesi's moves make sense. And the plan that he had back in the day makes sense. It just didn't work. If it worked, he'd be looking like a genius right now, getting rid of those older players and bringing in young talent. Just didn't work. So I don't know if there's anything wrong with this plan. The players that he drafted just weren't good. Draft different players, and we're looking at a completely different story right now. We're looking at, wow, what a move by the general manager to get rid of Kendricks and Barr and Tomlinson and Smith and Peterson and bring in all these guys on rookie contract. This is a Super Bowl team right now. It's like, because it didn't work, the plan didn't work. But the plan got him the job. The plan got Kwesi the job. You aren't walking into an interview and saying, you know what? This is going to take a few years. They're not going to hire that. That's not sexy. That's not going to light their eyes up. They're not going to look at the presentation and be like, oh, we want this guy. Especially the Minnesota Vikings, who don't like to rebuild. I mean, how many years have the Vikings been like a 3-13, 4-12 football team? Not very often. Even when they're supposed to be. They're not typically that bad. I remember a 3-13 season with like Christian Ponder or something like that, but or the year before we drafted him. But they're typically not that bad. So the owners don't like to rebuild. So I don't know. He did make mistakes by drafting the wrong guy, but it's like nobody knows who's going to pan out and who's not going to pan out. And the plan that he had made sense. So, being down 33-0, not liking that idea of trying to fix all the mistakes at once. It's like, looking back, it's like, oh, I would have done something different. Well, looking back, you wouldn't have the job right now if you did something different. So, anyway, those are just my takeaways on Kwesi Adofo-Mensah reflecting on the 2022 NFL Draft.